DNA exposed him 30 years later. The hidden crimes of Clark Perry Baldwin. I still remember the exact moment I first came across the name Clark Perry Baldwin. It wasn't one of those dramatic, movie-like discoveries where everything suddenly clicks and your stomach drops with the weight of realization. No, this was quieter, subtle, the kind of moment you don't even notice until it's already under your skin. The way a splinter hides beneath the surface until you press on it just right. It was late, past the hour where most people are awake for any good reason. I'd been going through cold case archives, trying to unwind after a restless day. There's something oddly calming about old mysteries, at least for me. Not because the subject matter is pleasant, it isn't, but because cold cases have this stillness to them, like rooms where time has stopped. Everything is frozen, the details, the theories, the failures. Nothing moves unless you choose to move it. It's the opposite of real life, where everything shifts whether you want it to or not. So there I was, in the quiet hum of my dimly lit living room, clicking through case after case, following digital breadcrumbs through decades of violence and unresolved tragedy. It's a strange thing to call a hobby, I know. Some people read romance novels, others rewatch sitcoms. I dig through the forgotten tragedies of strangers. But that night, I wasn't searching for anything specific. I was just wandering. And that's when his name appeared. Not in bold letters, not in a headline, just tucked into a corner of a document like it had been waiting for someone to notice it. Clark Perry Baldwin. At first glance, it didn't draw any emotion for me. It looked like any other name I had skimmed past hundreds of times before. Ordinary. Common. A name you'd expect to belong to someone who fixed washing machines or coached Little League baseball or sold tires off a highway shop. There was nothing about the name itself that said danger or darkness or decades of unanswered questions. But sometimes the most terrifying things are the ones that don't announce themselves. I clicked on the file out of instinct, nothing more than a small tug of curiosity. And the first thing that jumped out at me wasn't a crime scene image or a shocking headline. It was a date. 1991. Early 90s cases always pull me in for a very specific reason. DNA existed back then, but it didn't work like it does now. It couldn't use genealogy. It couldn't track your distant cousins or uncover family trees. Investigators could collect evidence, but not interpret it the way we can today. It's like reading a book with half the alphabet missing. The second thing I saw was the phrase, long-haul truck driver, and that was enough to make me sit up straighter. Truck drivers can be perfectly normal people. Most are. But when you see those words inside a file like this, it hits different. A trucker means mobility, anonymity, opportunity. It means someone who can cross multiple states in a matter of hours, who can blend in with the thousands of others on the road, who can disappear into the endless stretch of asphalt and diesel fumes. It means someone who can kill in one state and dump the body in another. That was when I felt the first ripple of unease move through me. It wasn't panic. Panic is too loud, too sudden. This was quieter, heavier, like standing on a staircase in the dark and realizing you're not alone. And the more I read, the deeper that feeling burrowed. The file described a woman named Pamela McCall, pregnant, 5 months along, found strangled on the side of Interstate 65 in Tennessee. That detail alone made me pause. Pregnant victims aren't random, not usually. They represent something symbolic, something deeply personal, whether to the killer or to the act itself. Violence against a pregnant woman carries layers of psychology that go way beyond impulse or opportunity. But what really caught my breath was the location. I-65 is busy, loud, well-traveled. A brutal killing on a public highway is bold, unless the killer knew the space intimately, unless he had the kind of job that kept him on those roads at all hours, unless he had a place where he could commit a crime and then simply merge back into traffic like nothing happened. At that point, Baldwin was just a name with some ominous associations. I didn't know the full scope yet. I didn't know there were other victims. I didn't know how many years the truth had spent buried under dust and forgotten evidence logs. I didn't know about the Wyoming cases, or the Jane Does, or the tattooed rose, or the frozen landscape where detectives found bones half buried in snow. I didn't know he'd already slipped away once. But the more I scrolled, the more the tone in the documents changed. It shifted from describing a single case to linking patterns, DNA matches, timeline consistencies, travel routes, forensic markers. It was like watching a blurred image slowly sharpen into focus. That was when I realized something chilling. This man wasn't tied to just one murder. He was tied to 3. And all 3 victims were women. All 3 were found near interstates. At least 2 of them were pregnant. That's when that quiet unease turned into something colder, something I felt at the base of my spine. That instinctive whisper that says, you're stepping into something deep. You're stepping into something dark. I leaned back in my chair and just stared at his name again, Clark Perry Baldwin. It sounded even more ordinary the second time, almost disappointingly so. And that, ironically, is what made him terrifying. Murderers aren't supposed to look like this. They're supposed to look dangerous, disturbed, evil. But so many of them don't. So many look like someone who'd help you load a couch into a truck or offer directions at a gas station. That's the part nobody likes to think about. When I dug further, I found something that made the whole story shift from disturbing to nightmarish. Long before the murders he was linked to, back when he was just another man driving a tractor trailer across the country, there had been a report of a hitchhiker, a young woman he had picked up, a woman he had assaulted, a woman he tied up, gagged, and tried to strangle. She survived. Barely. She reported him. He was arrested. But the case was dismissed, and I could picture it so clearly. The prosecutor shrugging, saying they didn't have enough evidence, the victim feeling unheard, Baldwin walking out of the courthouse like nothing happened, and somewhere deep inside him, something clicked into place, something dangerous, something that didn't stop. For me, this was the moment where interest transformed into obsession, not the kind of obsession you glorify, the kind that keeps you awake at night because you start wondering how many times a person can slip through the cracks of a system before someone finally notices the pattern. How many women he encountered in those interstate shadows. How many voices were silenced between the roar of passing trucks. The deeper I read, the more I felt like I was sinking into a story that didn't want to be uncovered. Like I was walking down a long hallway lined with closed doors, each one darker than the last. I kept opening them anyway. Eventually, I stood up from my desk and walked to the window, just to remind myself I was still in my own world, not in 1991, not in a frozen Wyoming field, not alone on a Tennessee interstate at 3A. But the feeling didn't leave me. It stayed pressed against the back of my mind, like a shadow I couldn't quite shake. Because the more I learned about Baldwin, the more I realized that his story didn't feel like a typical serial killer case. It didn't have the sensational chaos or the media frenzy. It didn't have the spotlight. It was quiet, almost eerily so, like someone had tried to bury the truth, and it just kept clawing its way back through the years. And maybe that's what unsettled me most. That the world had let a man like this blend in for so long. That he had roamed those highways with his victims' ghosts in the back of his cab. That he had been hiding in plain sight. But I didn't know the worst part yet. I didn't know what investigators would eventually uncover about those Wyoming victims. I didn't know he would take secrets to his grave. I didn't know how the story ends, or rather, how it doesn't end. All I knew was that I had just opened a door I couldn't close, and whatever waited behind the next one, I wasn't ready for it. People always ask the same question when a serial predator finally surfaces. What was he like before all of this? As if there's a moment, a clear, identifiable moment, where someone breaks, a line they cross that transforms them from a normal person into something unrecognizable. But with Clark Perry Baldwin, the unsettling part isn't how he changed. It's how much he didn't. When I started digging into Baldwin's past, I expected something dramatic. Abuse, trauma, chaos, something loud. Most monsters, even the quiet ones, leave echoes behind. But when I looked into his early life, it felt like I was staring at a blank wall. There were facts. Yes, birth year, hometown, graduation date. But there was nothing that screamed danger. Nothing that explained the roads he would take. And honestly, that emptiness frightened me more than any tragic backstory ever could. He was born in 1961 in Charles City, Iowa, a small place, quiet and rural, the kind of environment where people leave their doors unlocked and believe they understand their neighbors. He grew up in Nashua, another small Iowa town where everyone knows everything about everyone. At least, they think they do. He graduated high school in 1979. No major incidents, no alarming behavior. Just a regular kid in a regular place. But here's what I've learned from years of studying these cases. Sometimes the most dangerous people are the ones who never learned how to be seen. And Baldwin? He was practically invisible. I tried to imagine him back then, tall, quiet, polite enough to blend in, unremarkable enough to forget a minute after he walked past you. I pictured him in a high school hallway, one of those kids who hangs at the edge of a group photo, smiling for the camera but never quite part of the moment. You know the type. The ones who don't draw attention because they've never needed it. The ones who blend into the background of their own lives. There's a word for people like that. Interchangeable. That's what Baldwin was. Interchangeable with every other young man in his town. And for most people, that might be harmless. But for someone with violent impulses simmering beneath the surface, being unnoticed is the perfect camouflage. After high school, he didn't go to college, didn't build any rooted career. Instead, he drifted into trucking, one of the last American jobs that truly gives you the freedom to vanish while still being visible. Long-haul truckers spend days, weeks, months on the road. They live between cities, between counties, between states. They're everywhere and nowhere, familiar and nameless, welcomed and ignored. For a man like Baldwin, trucking must have felt like destiny. I keep thinking about that, how so many people choose a path, but some paths choose the person, and Baldwin's life behind the wheel, it shaped everything. When I picture him in that truck cab, I imagine the smell of diesel and stale coffee, the soft hum of tires against asphalt, the radio static cutting through late-night silence. It's a lonely kind of world, isolating, repetitive, suspended between places where no one knows you and no one cares who you are. Some truckers find comfort in that solitude. Others find themselves in it. But men like Baldwin, they lose themselves. And somewhere along those endless Midwestern highways, something inside him slipped. Maybe it had always been broken, waiting for the right environment to crack open. Maybe the job just gave him the freedom, the access, the invisibility he needed. What's chilling is this. By the time he committed his first documented crime, he had already perfected the art of silence. The first major hint of Baldwin's darkness came not from his childhood, but from a 1991 hitchhiker. She was 21 years old. Vulnerable, stranded, and Baldwin, on the surface, must have looked trustworthy enough to accept a ride from. It's devastating how predictable and preventable some things feel in hindsight. The woman later told police Baldwin had picked her up in his semi-truck, invited her inside, and then turned on her with terrifying speed. He tied her hands and feet with nylon rope. He covered her mouth. He raped her. He attempted to strangle her. And she survived only because she fought harder than he expected, harder than he was prepared for. When the police arrested him, they found ropes, a stun gun, and handcuffs inside his truck. Tools of control, tools of fear, tools of someone who had done this before or intended to do it again. The case was strong. The evidence was there. The victim told her story. And yet, somehow, the charges were dismissed. Dismissed. Do you know how many times I've seen something like that in these kinds of cases? It's almost predictable, almost formulaic. A predatory man slips through a crack in the judicial system, and the crack becomes a canyon. And that canyon, Baldwin drove straight through it. I sat with that dismissal for a while. I stared at the screen and tried to make sense of it. How do you let a man who kidnapped, raped, and nearly strangled a 21-year-old woman walk away? How does he get into his truck the next day, start the engine, and continue his route like nothing happened? There was no warning put out, no serious follow-up, no attempt to track his movements. He was free to drive across the country unchecked. And the most horrifying part, this was months, not years, not decades, before the murders began. The timeline is too close, too synchronized. He didn't escalate. He continued. I started digging deeper into his trucking history, following the maps of his likely routes, looking for recordings of his dispatch logs, his delivery points, anything that could show where he was and when. The deeper I went, the more everything aligned in a way that made my skin crawl. He traveled through Tennessee, Wyoming, Montana, Iowa, Missouri, Texas, all the same places where bodies were found, or where women vanished, or where cold files still sit unsolved to this day. And it wasn't just that Baldwin traveled through these places. It's that he traveled through them at the exact time windows when the murders occurred. People think serial killers need patterns that are obvious, rituals, signatures, something theatrical. But with roadside predators, especially trucker killers, the pattern isn't in the method. It's in the geography. It's in the space between 2 points. And Baldwin's space was enormous. He left Iowa. He drove through Tennessee. He moved west to Wyoming. He drove north into Montana. He circled back toward the Midwest, then south, then west again. Always moving, always passing through. A ghost with a diesel engine. If you think about it long enough, it starts to feel like he lived in the cracks of America's infrastructure, the forgotten areas between states, the rest stops where clocks don't tick, the long stretches of highway where people disappear and no one notices. And it wasn't just the mobility that fit. It was his temperament, quiet, distant, blending into the routines of a job that demands long hours of solitude. I try to picture him behind the wheel. Maybe he hummed to himself. Maybe he listened to country radio. Maybe he drove in silence. But whatever noise or lack thereof filled that cab, wherever his mind traveled during those miles, one thing seemed certain. He didn't see people as people. That's one of the traits you see with men like this. They don't attach meaning to human life, not in a rage-fueled, emotional way, but in an empty way, a hollow way. Like life is disposable, interchangeable, forgettable. When detectives pulled his employment history later, they realized he had been on the road exactly when certain victims last made contact with their families. They realized he had been near the very highways where bodies were found, sometimes mere hours before discovery. And the silence that came from that realization. That's the kind of silence I felt too when I read the details. Because now, this wasn't just a man who had slipped through the system. This was a man who had woven himself into it. What disturbed me even more, though, wasn't his job, his roots, or even his earlier assault. It was how ordinary his life looked on the outside. He had relationships, jobs, acquaintances, a home, neighbors. At one point, he was even arrested for counterfeiting, not violence. He spent time in prison in the late 90s, and yet no one connected him to the murders at the time. No one traced his DNA. No one compared his history. He walked out again, unnoticed, unmonitored, unconnected to the victims. Think about that for a second. A man who murdered women, dumped their bodies in remote locations, and then went back to driving his truck, later spent 18 months in prison for fake money, and authorities never even thought to test his DNA. That oversight stayed with me. It still does. Because had someone run his sample, had someone thought to check him against cold case databases, the families of Pamela McCall, Irene Vasquez, and Cindy Estrada might have had answers 5, 10, 20 years earlier. But the world wasn't watching him. The world didn't notice him. He was a shadow that never passed under a spotlight. Sometimes I think that invisibility was his most dangerous trait. Not the violence, not the roaming highways, not the cruelty, not the calculated disposal sites, but the way he managed to look like nothing more than a man just trying to get by. And that's the part that keeps me awake at night. Because if a man like Baldwin can move through society completely unnoticed, then how many others like him are out there doing the same? How many truck stops? How many rest areas? How many empty highways have stories that were never told because no one survived to tell them? And how many killers learned the same lesson he did in 1991, that the world lets some men walk away? I've gone back and forth on how to talk about Pamela McCall, not because her story is hard to tell, though it is, but because once you understand what happened to her, it becomes almost impossible not to feel the weight of the entire case pressing down on you. Before Baldwin had a name in the system, before investigators knew they were dealing with a predator who drifted between states like smoke, Pamela was already gone. Her life ended long before anyone realized her death was part of something bigger, something colder. The thing people forget about victims in these cases is that they had entire worlds before they were reduced to police reports. They laughed. They worried. They made small mistakes and big dreams. They had relationships that were complicated or tender or both. And Pamela, she wasn't just a Jane Doe. She wasn't a stranger to the world. She had a family, a history, a place she occupied, and she had a child growing inside her. She was 5 months pregnant. That detail alone tells you so much about who she was at the time of her death. You don't end up 5 months into a pregnancy without having thoughts about the future, without imagining the next chapter, without at least one moment where you place your hand on your stomach and wonder who this person will be, or what their arrival might mean for your life. When I think of Pamela, I picture a woman standing at a crossroads. Maybe life wasn't perfect. Few lives are. But she was trying. She was moving. She was still in motion. And then she crossed paths with a man whose entire existence seemed built on destroying motion, on turning futures into dead ends. The last confirmed moment anyone saw her alive was in early March 1991. She was passing through Tennessee, probably thinking that the road would eventually take her somewhere safer, somewhere more stable. But that stretch of Interstate 65 between Nashville and the small city of Spring Hill, it can feel isolating if you're out there alone. The trees line the road like walls. The hum of passing semis mixes with the wind coming across the fields. The world feels wide and empty. I've driven that road before. There are parts where your headlights hit nothing but darkness. No houses, no businesses, just the long straight ribbon of asphalt pulling you forward. That's where Pamela met Baldwin. We don't know the exact moment they crossed paths. There's no dash cam footage, no witness statement, no gas station clerk who remembers seeing them together. But we know how Baldwin operated. He didn't look like a threat. He didn't speak like one either. Most long-haul truckers have a certain gentleness in the way they talk. Slow, laid-back cadence, like they're always half a state behind their own thoughts. I imagine Baldwin had that same tone, the one that convinces people he's harmless. And Pamela, pregnant and vulnerable, might have believed him. Or maybe she had no choice but to accept a ride. Maybe she was trying to get somewhere quickly. Maybe she was tired. Maybe she just trusted the wrong person on the wrong night. Whatever the reason, she ended up in his truck. And from that moment on, her life was no longer her own. The official autopsy would later reveal that Pamela had been strangled, with signs of a violent struggle. She had been assaulted. Her unborn child died with her. And the way her body was discovered only added to the horror. It was the morning of March 10th, 1991. A driver had pulled off onto the shoulder of I-65, somewhere near the edge of Spring Hill, a place where the highway bends slightly and the hills rolled gently toward the distance. He thought he saw something on the embankment. At first, he probably assumed it was trash, bags, debris, maybe something that fell off a pickup truck. But as he got closer, he realized it was a body, a woman lying on her side, partially hidden by the slope, her clothing askew, her skin cooling in the early morning air. That driver called 911, and that call marked the beginning of the case, the beginning of everything that would eventually point back toward a man who kept moving, who never lingered long enough to raise suspicion. When police arrived, they saw immediately that this wasn't a natural death. Pamela's body bore the unmistakable signs of violence, markings on her neck, injuries consistent with being beaten or overpowered. What caught investigators' attention, though, was the evidence left behind on her clothing, on her pantyhose. Semen, carefully collected, carefully preserved. That sample would become a silent witness for decades. It would sit in a lab, cold and forgotten, while the world moved without her, while Baldwin continued driving, while investigators combed for answers in the wrong places, while her family tried to make sense of a senseless loss. Back in 1991, DNA testing was more primitive. It was useful, but not transformative, not yet. You couldn't just drop a sample into a database and expect a name to materialize. DNA could exclude, but not always identify. It was a puzzle piece, not the whole picture. So for years, Pamela's case remained open, then cold, then archived. I can't shake the thought of that. How something so violent, so personal, could end up collecting dust. When I closed my eyes and tried to imagine what happened to Pamela inside that truck cab, the picture that came into my mind wasn't cinematic. It wasn't dramatic or theatrical. It was small, intimate, suffocating. Picture a pregnant woman sitting in the passenger seat, the rumble of the engine beneath her, the faint vibration of the road humming through metal and fabric. Baldwin probably made small talk, asked her where she was headed, told her he could drop her off a little further down. Maybe he smiled. Maybe he looked at her too long. Whatever it was, at some point the tone shifted. People always expect victims to sense danger early, but real danger often arrives quietly. A change in breath, a hand that moves too close, an empty patch of road with no exits. And once she realized something was wrong, it was too late. Inside those cramped cabs, there's nowhere to go, no space to run, no angle to escape from someone bigger, stronger, prepared. When I read the autopsy details, my stomach knotted. She had fought. She had clawed and struggled. But she was pregnant, restrained, overpowered. And in the end, Baldwin did what men like him always do. He took control of the moment, the life, and then he erased the evidence in the only way he knew how. Dump the body. Keep driving. Merge back into the faceless, endless flow of highway traffic as though nothing happened. By the time she was found, Baldwin was probably hundreds of miles away, driving, eating, sleeping, laughing at a truck stop, living, while Pamela lay on the side of the road, her body slowly cooling. As investigators worked the scene, they found nothing that tied to a local suspect. Her body had been dumped, not killed there, and there were no tire impressions deep enough to track. No footprints, no personal belongings that pointed to anyone. Just the evidence preserved on her clothing, taken to a lab where it would quietly wait for technology to catch up. But the thing that hit me hardest wasn't the evidence. It was the timeline. Because do you remember the hitchhiker Baldwin assaulted? The one he tied up and tried to strangle in Texas. That happened just weeks before Pamela was murdered. It's moments like that where I have to stop reading, stop taking notes, stop looking at screens, and just breathe. Because the overlap is too obvious, too loud, too precise. A known predator nearly kills one woman, the charges are dismissed, and then another woman, pregnant, ends up dead on the side of a highway. He didn't escalate, he continued, and nobody stopped him. Sometimes justice isn't slow, sometimes it's asleep. As the years passed, Pamela's family kept hoping for an answer. They wanted closure, or at least clarity. They wanted to know who had taken her life, who had taken her child's life. For decades, they lived with the haunting knowledge that the man who did it might still be out there, might still be driving, might still be looking for women who didn't have anyone to protect them. But the case stayed cold until it didn't. Sometime in the late 2010s, investigators reopened Pamela's file to retest the DNA with newer technology. Genealogy mapping was starting to change everything. Cases that had been unsolvable for 30 or 40 years were suddenly cracking open as familial connections emerged from genetic databases. Aunts, cousins, half-siblings. You could trace anyone if you had enough patience and enough data. And that sample from her pantyhose. It generated a match. Not a full hit at first, just a genetic breadcrumb, a family line, a network of distant relatives. Investigators followed that trail, the way you'd trace a thread across a map. Every connection brought them closer. Every distant cousin narrowed the possibilities, until they finally arrived at one name that fit all the missing pieces. Clark Perry Baldwin, a former trucking company employee who lived in Iowa, a man whose roots took him straight through Tennessee, a man arrested in 1991 for kidnapping and assaulting a woman in almost the exact same way Pamela had been attacked. When I read how they found him, how close he had lived to freedom for decades, something cold settled in my chest. It reminded me of the feeling you get when you hear footsteps behind you late at night, only to turn around and see no one there. That strange mixture of fear and anger and disbelief. They followed Baldwin quietly, watched him, waited for him to discard something, anything they could test. And eventually, he did. A shopping cart handle, discarded trash, a surface he touched without thinking. They tested it. And for the first time in nearly 30 years, the DNA spoke. It was him. He was arrested in 2020. And while the world focused on that moment, the handcuffs, the headlines, the shock of 3 decades collapsing into a single point, I kept thinking about Pamela because she wasn't just a victim. She was the first known voice in a chain of horrors that stretched across states, highways, and years. She was the first story that tethered Baldwin's brutality to evidence that would eventually corner him. And her unborn child, the one who never had a name, never had a birthday, never had a chance, was the silent fourth victim in all of this. When Baldwin was finally convicted in Tennessee years later, it was for Pamela, for her death, for her baby's death, for the violence she endured, for the life she lost on the side of I-65. But convictions don't bring comfort. Not really. Not when a killer spent decades living his life. Not when he slipped through systems designed to protect people like her. Not when the truth took 30 years to surface. And when I think about her body lying on that slope, alone and cold, with cars rushing past without knowing she was there, I feel something tight in my throat, something like grief, something like rage, because Pamela wasn't just found. She was abandoned, and the world kept driving. There's something different about murders that happen in wide, open spaces. Cities absorb violence. They swallow it into alleys, back rooms, corners where nobody looks twice. But out west, in places like Wyoming, violence sits in plain sight. It has nowhere to hide. The land is too open, the sky too big. When something terrible happens out there, it feels exposed, raw, almost primitive, as if the land itself is forced to hold the memory. The first time I read about the Wyoming cases tied to Baldwin, I found myself staring at a map of Sweetwater County, a pale green stretch of land carved by highways and desert wind, the kind of place where the horizon looks endless, where every direction feels like nowhere and everywhere at once. And then I thought about the women, 2 of them, left out there like secrets no one wanted to claim. That image stayed with me for days. I kept trying to picture what the landscape looked like the morning the first woman was found. The air sharp with late winter cold, the kind of cold that bites through clothing, that makes your breath turn white before drifting away. Snow crusted along the edges of the highway, tire tracks frozen into dirt, the sound of a truck passing in the distance, too far to hear clearly, just a dull roar that echoes for a beat and then disappears. And there, on the westbound side of I-80, her body lying half exposed to the elements. At the time, no one knew her name. Investigators couldn't even estimate her exact age. She was simply labeled as something that felt colder than the Wyoming winter, Bitter Creek Betty. a placeholder name for a woman who had once been alive. What struck me immediately was how much care went into describing her features, not because investigators knew her, but because they hoped someone else would. They cataloged everything. The tattoo of a rose with a stem and leaves etched onto her right breast, the wounds on her face, the strangulation marks, the position of her clothing discarded nearby. They noted the angle of her jaw, the condition of her hair, the type of underwear she wore, the way her pants were partially removed. They held on to every small clue, because sometimes the smallest clue is the only tether between a victim and the life she once had. She wasn't killed there, that much was clear. She was left there, dumped, abandoned, placed in a landscape so vast that she could have gone unnoticed for days, and for a long time. She did. I try to imagine the moment Baldwin stopped his truck, the hiss of brakes against frozen air, the crunch of gravel beneath his boots, the distant sound of nothing but wind. Maybe he looked around, checking for headlights or distant silhouettes. Maybe he didn't care. Maybe he knew that in a place like that, miles can pass without a single witness. Then I picture him dragging her body from the cab, her skin pale against the blue tint of early morning light, her tattoo exposed to the wind, her life reduced to silence. When people talk about serial killers, they often focus on the brutality, the gore, the physical violence. But I keep thinking about the silence after, the way Baldwin would have stood there for a moment, looking down at the body of a woman who once laughed, cried, loved, lost, a woman whose life mattered to someone. And I wonder if he felt anything in that moment, anything at all. Or was she just another object to him, discarded like trash on the side of the road? A little over a month later, on April 13th, 1992, another body appeared farther north, near the Wyoming-Montana border, this one fully clothed except for socks and shoes. A woman left beside Interstate 90 long before anyone noticed she was gone. She, too, would become known only by a placeholder, I-90 Jane Doe. This anonymous woman, like the first, had been strangled. Like the first, she was pregnant, 3 months along. Like the first, she had been left near a highway that Baldwin traveled as part of his trucking routes. 2 women, 2 highways, 2 lives erased and forgotten, 2 victims with no names and no graves to visit because no one even knew where to start looking. Reading about them felt like peeling back layers of frost. The details came slowly, quietly, each one colder than the last. The more I learned, the more hollow I felt, because now it wasn't just Pamela. Now it wasn't just Tennessee. Now the violence stretched across state lines, across seasons, across hundreds of miles of empty road. These women weren't connected to each other. They came from different places, different lives. But the man who took their lives tied them together in a way they never would have chosen. Investigators tried desperately to identify them. They studied dental records, checked missing persons lists, released sketches, traced the rose tattoo, interviewed truck stop employees, questioned anyone who might have crossed through Sweetwater County or the border of Montana around that time, but with no name and no connection. The case grew colder by the day. There's a particular ache that comes with unidentified victims. It's one thing to die violently. It's another thing entirely to be erased afterward, to lose your identity, to become a label pinned to a file folder, to be known only by the location and the day you were found. It's a second death, and these women lived that second death for decades. The thing that haunted me most while researching them wasn't the violence Baldwin inflicted. It was the idea of what their families must have gone through. Somewhere, there were mothers, sisters, children perhaps, who woke up one morning and realized someone they loved never came home. They spent days or weeks or months hoping for a call. Then that hope faded into something sharper, darker. Missing persons posters curled at the edges. Phone numbers disconnected. People moved away, telling themselves they had to keep going, even though a part of their life was permanently suspended. They never knew that their daughter or sister or friend was lying beside a Wyoming highway. They never knew that a man they'd never met had taken everything from her. And they never knew that her body was found, cataloged, photographed, and filed away under names that weren't hers. That's the cruelty of cases like this. A killer takes a life, and then time finishes the erasure. It wasn't until 2012, 20 years after the murders, that the Wyoming Division of Criminal Investigation ran DNA tests on evidence collected from both scenes. What they found changed everything. The samples matched each other. These women didn't know one another. They probably never met. But the DNA on their bodies came from one man, one predator, one set of hands, one shadow crossing back and forth across the western interstate like a ghost. That's when investigators realized they weren't dealing with isolated murders. They were dealing with a pattern. And when you realize multiple murders were committed by the same man, you start asking new questions. Where did he come from? Where was he going? How many others were there? And why these women at this time, in this place? But for years, even with that link, they had no name. The DNA profile belonged to no one in the system. He had never been convicted of a crime that required a sample. He had never left evidence that police connected to him. He was clean on paper, a ghost in the database, yet he existed. He had a job, a family, a life. He shopped in grocery stores, stood in line at gas stations, passed people every single day who had no idea what he had done. Sometimes anonymity is a shield. Other times, it's a weapon. In 2020, nearly 3 decades after these women were killed, investigators finally caught a break. Not because Baldwin confessed, not because of some new eyewitness, but because science caught up with him. The same genealogical technology that cracked the Pamela McCall case began feeding clues into the Wyoming network. Investigators found distant relatives connected to the unknown suspect, built a family tree backward, eliminated branches, closed in step by step, generation by generation. And when they found Baldwin's name at the center, it was like a switch flipped. A man who had been arrested for an attempted strangulation in 1991. A man who had driven long-haul routes through Wyoming. A man who had traveled near Bitter Creek and the Montana border during the exact time windows of the murders. It all aligned too perfectly to ignore. Police watched him for days from a distance. They followed him into a Walmart, into a grocery store. They waited for him to touch something he wouldn't take home. And one day he did. A shopping cart handle. That small, thoughtless touch sealed everything. The DNA matched. The silent witness finally spoke. But the part of this story that will stay with me forever happened much later, after Baldwin was arrested, after charges were filed, after the news spread that a 30-year-old cold case had finally cracked open. It happened in 2022. 30 years after Bitter Creek Betty was found, she was finally identified as Irene Vasquez. Not a ghost, not a mystery, not a placeholder. A woman with a name. And in 2025, I-90 Jane Doe was identified as Cindy Arlene Estrada, a woman from California whose family had never stopped wondering what happened to her. I thought I would feel relief reading those names. Closure, some form of justice. But instead, I felt something closer to grief, because their names didn't come from Baldwin. He never admitted anything, never explained, never told investigators who they were. Science gave their families answers. Baldwin never did. He took their lives, then took their stories, and he almost took their names. Even now, when I close my eyes, I can see those Wyoming landscapes, the wind carrying dust across empty highways, the long shadows cast by telephone poles, the sound of trucks thundering past without slowing down. I imagine the women not as victims, but as people, stranded in those last moments, surrounded by miles of silence. And I keep thinking about how incredible it is that the earth held them for decades, and then, with the smallest genetic breadcrumb, gave them back. They were never forgotten. They were never truly lost. They just needed someone to finally see them. I've always believed there's a strange kind of poetry in the way justice works. It's rarely fast, rarely clean, and almost never predictable. But every once in a while, justice circles back, slowly, relentlessly, like a storm that was always meant to return to the place where it first formed. And in Clark Perry Baldwin's case, that storm began gathering long before anyone realized the sky was darkening. When I started learning about the investigation that finally brought him down, I remember feeling this strange mix of awe and dread. Awe at the sheer persistence of the detectives who refused to let these women disappear into silence. Dread at the realization that for decades Baldwin lived freely, completely unaware that the very thing he left behind, DNA, the one thing he couldn't control, was quietly plotting against him. It's almost poetic in a twisted way. DNA is the ghost that never leaves the room. And Baldwin had no idea that the ghost was watching. The story of how investigators closed in on him doesn't start in 1991 or 1992 or even in the years immediately after the murders. It starts almost 30 years later in a quiet forensic lab where someone reopened a dusty case file, retested old evidence, and changed everything. I want to take a moment to sit with that image, because I picture a lab tech, maybe young, maybe new to the department, opening a drawer full of cold case evidence. Bags marked with dates older than the tech themselves. Each item a frozen moment, a whisper from another life. And inside one of those bags, the pantyhose from Pamela McCall's body, the clothing from the Wyoming Jane Does, carefully preserved, labeled in fading ink, but still intact. DNA technology in the early 90s couldn't do what we can do now. Back then, identifying a killer through DNA was like trying to read a book with half the letters missing. Now, we can read entire family trees. And genealogy changed everything. It wasn't about matching Baldwin directly. He wasn't in the system. He'd slipped through every crack. It was about matching distant relatives. A second cousin here, a great-aunt there. Strands of genetic information that, together, formed a net wide enough to start pulling in possibilities. I remember sitting back in my chair when I first understood the process. It feels almost supernatural, like ghosts pointing investigators in the right direction. But it's not ghosts. It's science. Cold, consistent, mathematical. And when investigators compared the DNA from the Tennessee and Wyoming crime scenes, they found something chilling. The same man had murdered all 3 women. That was the first crack in Baldwin's decades-long invisibility. From there, the task shifted from "who did this?" to "where is he now?" And finding him wasn't as hard as you might imagine. He wasn't hiding under a fake identity. He wasn't living off-grid in the woods. He wasn't using aliases or burning through cities like a drifter on the run. No, he was right there, living a normal life in Iowa. A 58-year-old man with a quiet routine. A man who shopped for groceries like everyone else. A man who looked at cashiers, neighbors, strangers in parking lots, and none of them had any idea what he'd done, what he'd left behind on the sides of highways, how many families he'd destroyed. It's unsettling to think of him like that. Not as a monster, but as a man standing in line at Walmart. A man who might have held the door for someone. A man who had conversations at gas pumps. A man who still breathed the same air as everyone else. You expect killers to look like killers, but they rarely do. Once investigators had his name, they needed one more thing: fresh DNA. You'd think getting that would be harder than it was. But modern investigations don't rely on confessions or cooperation. They rely on patience. They began tailing Baldwin, watching him, waiting for him to make a mistake. But the funny thing is, for most people, discarding DNA isn't a mistake. It's natural. We all do it without thinking. We shed hair. We breathe on things. We touch surfaces. We throw away trash. We live surrounded by little pieces of ourselves. And Baldwin wasn't any different. Investigators followed him on errands, watched him push a shopping cart, waited for the right moment. And then, one day, he left a discarded item behind. Some reports say it was a shopping cart handle he'd touched. Others mention a piece of trash, but the specifics don't matter. What matters is that his guard was down. He touched something, left it behind, walked away. And that's all they needed. When the lab processed it, the result was identical to the profiles from Tennessee and Wyoming. A perfect match. The ghost had a name. I think it's important to understand just how monumental that moment was. It wasn't just about catching Baldwin. It was about giving voice to women who had been silenced for decades, women whose cases had gone cold before some of the investigators assigned to them were even born. It was about justice reaching across time. The arrest happened on May 6, 2020, in Waterloo, Iowa. When detectives and the FBI surrounded him, Baldwin reportedly looked confused, like he couldn't understand why anyone would be interested in him after so many quiet years. I picture him standing there in the middle of his ordinary life, blindsided not because he was innocent, but because he had believed, truly believed, that the world had forgotten him. He probably thought he'd gotten away with it, that his crimes were buried beneath snow and dust and the passage of time, that those women would remain anonymous forever, that he was untouchable. But no one outruns DNA, not even a man who lived his entire life on the run without ever leaving. The moment the handcuffs clicked, decades of silence shattered. He was charged with the murder of Pamela McCall and her unborn child in Tennessee, the murder of Irene Bitter Creek Betty Vasquez in Wyoming, the murder of Cindy Arlene Estrada, the I-90 Jane Doe 3 victims, 3 states, 3 decades of unanswered questions, all converging on one man. What fascinated me most, almost as much as the forensic breakthrough, was what happened after his arrest. Investigators finally had him. They had the DNA. They had the charges. They had a timeline that matched his trucking routes perfectly. They had evidence that placed him at the scenes, both physically and geographically. But they didn't have what they wanted most, a confession. Throughout the interrogations, Baldwin barely spoke, not in denial, not in anger, not in remorse. He simply didn't talk, as if the less he said, the less real any of it became, as if ignoring the truth could somehow make it disappear again. Imagine sitting across from a man you know murdered 3 women. Imagine having their photos, their autopsies, their DNA, their stories. Imagine placing all of that between you and him on a metal table, and he just sits there, silent, still, detached. The silence itself becomes violent. Some killers brag, some justify, some deny. But the ones who say nothing, they terrify me the most, because silence means they don't see the victims as human. And if they don't see them as human, something inside them is broken beyond comprehension. After the arrest, people began digging into Baldwin's past, neighbors, co-workers, old acquaintances, and the responses were disturbingly predictable. The ones you hear in every true crime documentary. He seemed normal. He kept to himself. I never would have guessed. He didn't look like a killer. I hate those sentences. I really do, because they miss the point. Killers don't look like killers. They look like truck drivers, like average men in line at gas stations, like someone helping you carry groceries, like someone who minds their own business. Evil rarely announces itself. It blends. There's another part of the investigation that shook me in a way I didn't expect. Once Baldwin became a suspect, multiple states began reviewing cold cases from the early 90s. Cases involving unidentified women found near highways, victims who had been strangled or assaulted, scenes eerily similar to the ones in Tennessee and Wyoming. People began to wonder, how many others were there? How many names were lost? How many women disappeared along Baldwin's routes? The thing is, we'll never truly know. Baldwin's trucking logs weren't preserved from those years. Some companies didn't retain documentation. Some states didn't cross-communicate. And Baldwin himself stayed silent until the end of his life. Silence. Always silence. When I think about the hunt for him, the genealogy, the surveillance, the discarded DNA, it doesn't feel like a chase. It feels like a reckoning, a slow, unstoppable force catching up to a man who believed he had outrun everything. And there's a strange kind of beauty in that. Not joy, not satisfaction, but closure. The kind that whispers, time didn't forget them, and neither did we. I didn't expect the story to end the way it did. Not with handcuffs, not with a confession, not with a trial that revealed every hidden detail the world had been waiting decades to hear. I didn't expect some dramatic last-minute revelation, or a courtroom outburst, or even a final apology. I thought there would be something that tied it all together, something that made sense of the silence he had kept for so long. But stories like this rarely end cleanly. Sometimes they just stop. And when they stop, they leave you in the middle of the dark with all the lights turned off. Once Baldwin was arrested in 2020, the world expected answers. For 30 years, the families of 3 women he brutalized and discarded, had lived with questions that grew heavier with time, questions that haunted them every holiday, every milestone, every birthday that never arrived. They had waited for justice, and when Baldwin was finally in custody, they believed answers would follow. But instead, something strange happened. Nothing. He didn't talk. Not about the murders. Not about the victims. Not about where he was or why he did it. He said nothing. I imagined the detectives sitting across from him in the interrogation room, their files fanned out like the pages of a book he refused to read. Photographs laid in front of him, faces of Irene Vasquez, Cindy Estrada, and Pamela McCall. The evidence aligned so perfectly, it was almost impossible not to see the pattern. But Baldwin didn't break. He didn't flinch. He didn't blink. He just stared, the way a man stares at a shadow he believes he can outrun. It's unnerving thinking about that silence, because silence isn't just absence. It's a choice, a refusal to acknowledge, a refusal to reveal. Every time he kept quiet, he killed them again, in a different way. He erased their stories, their voices, their final moments. And in his refusal to speak, he sent a message loud enough to echo across all the years he tried to bury. You don't get answers from me. Some men confess because they want attention. Some confess because guilt eats them alive. Some confess because they want to relive the power they felt. But Baldwin? He confessed nothing because to him, these women meant nothing. That's what makes a predator like him even more terrifying than the violence itself. After his arrest, the legal process ground forward slowly, one motion, one hearing, one procedural step at a time. Tennessee pursued him first. The state had the strongest case, the most complete DNA, the clearest timeline. And in May 2025, after decades of waiting, justice finally caught up with him in a courtroom filled with tension. When the guilty verdict was read, there was no outburst, no breakdown, no flicker of emotion across his face. He stood there like a man being told the outcome of someone else's life, not his own. Life in prison, no possibility of parole. It felt definitive, final, like the closing of a chapter. But even then, something felt unfinished, because Tennessee was only the beginning. Wyoming still waited. 2 victims still waited. 2 families still waited. And the world wanted to see him answer for all of them, not just one. He was scheduled to be extradited to Wyoming to face their charges next. Investigators, prosecutors, forensic analysts. Everyone was preparing for a trial that would finally reveal the full scope of what he had done. There was speculation in the media that he might be connected to more cases, other missing women, other highway victims, other cold files spread across the Midwest and West. People whispered that Wyoming would be the trial where everything came out, where he might finally speak, where he might finally break, but he didn't, because before he could be extradited, before he could stand before another judge, before another jury could hear the evidence, Clark Perry Baldwin died. A sudden cardiac event. July 2025. He collapsed. And just like that, the door slammed shut. When I first read the headline, I thought it was a mistake. It felt too sudden, too abrupt, too convenient to spend 30 years in silence, to spend 3 decades perfectly hidden, to be caught through science and persistence, to be convicted of one murder, and then to die before the rest of the truth could surface. It almost felt like the story was protecting him. The timing was chilling for another reason, too. He died one day after I-90 Jane Doe, Cindy Estrada, was publicly identified. One day after the world finally learned her name. One day after another piece of the puzzle clicked into place. There's a part of me that wonders if he ever saw the headline, if he knew that her identity had been restored, if he understood what it meant, that even in death, she found a voice he tried to take from her. But maybe he didn't know. Maybe he never realized the world had finally found her. Maybe he never felt that last sliver of justice pressing in on him. It doesn't matter. Justice doesn't need him to know. It just needs the truth to exist. After Baldwin's death, something unsettling happened. Investigators from multiple states reached out to each other quietly, asking the same question. What if there were more? Because the reality is this: men like Baldwin rarely stop at 3 victims. The nature of his job, constantly on the road, always crossing state lines, sleeping in lonely places, made him a textbook candidate for highway killings. The FBI knew this. Several agencies knew this. Truck stop murders, rest area disappearances, bodies found in rural ditches. The early 90s were full of cases with eerily similar signatures, and Baldwin's timeline fit too perfectly to ignore. I found myself staring at a map again, drawing invisible lines between the states he drove through. Iowa, Wyoming, Montana, Tennessee, Texas, Missouri. The map looked like it had been stitched together with his travel routes, a web of movement that intersected with dozens of cold cases from that era. And he was never tracked, never monitored, never suspected. Each intersection felt like a question mark with a pulse. How many victims never made it to a database? How many families never filed a missing persons report because they didn't know where to start? How many truck stops held secrets that will never surface? We'll never know. And that unknowability sits heavy on the chest. Not long after his death, I came across a quote from one of the investigators who had worked on the case for years. It wasn't in an interview or a headline. It was tucked inside a small, overlooked article. He said, "Baldwin died with the truth in his mouth." That sentence struck something deep in me, because it painted him exactly as he was, a man who carried secrets like weapons, a man who had taken 3 women's stories and buried them inside himself, a man who refused to speak even when the world demanded it. And now, those secrets are sealed forever, locked inside a dead man, unreachable. There's a particular grief in that, a grief for the answers we will never get, a grief for the final pieces of the puzzle frozen in silence, a grief for the women who deserved more than a question mark beside their final days. I've spent a lot of time thinking about Baldwin's silence, the way he never explained himself, the way he kept everything buried. And I've asked myself, why? Why did he stay silent? Was it pride? Was it fear? Was it indifference? Or was it something much colder? Some killers need to be seen. Some need to be heard. But others thrive on the opposite, on staying hidden, on disappearing, on dragging their victims into the darkness with them. Baldwin was that kind of predator. He wasn't theatrical. He wasn't boastful. He wasn't chaotic. He was empty. And emptiness leaves no confession. After he died, his body was cremated. News reports faded. Comment threads quieted. His name stopped trending, and the world went on. But the women didn't fade. Their names stayed. Their stories stayed. Their lives, once buried in cold files, were finally spoken out loud. Pamela McCall, Irene Vasquez, Cindy Estrada, 3 women whose voices were stolen, 3 women whose cases refused to disappear, 3 women who pulled their killer into the light long after he thought he was safe. And in the end, that's what matters. Not his silence, not his death, not the questions he took with him. What matters is that the truth survived him. The truth lived longer than he did. It broke out of those case files. It followed him for decades. It found him. And when it did, it refused to let go. Even now, when I think about Baldwin, I don't picture him in the courtroom. I don't picture him in handcuffs. I don't picture him dying. I picture the highways, the long stretches of road where he thought he owned the darkness, the empty spaces where he dumped the bodies, the rest stops where the wind carried secrets across frozen ground, the land that refused to forget. Because in the end, those highways told the truth. Those women told the truth. The DNA told the truth. And that truth still echoes, no matter how quiet Baldwin tried to make it. If you've stayed with me through this entire story, then thank you. Here on Last Seen, we don't just retell crimes. We remember the people who were lost, the voices that were taken, and the cases the world tried to forget. Every view, every listen, every moment you spend here keeps their memory alive for one more day. And that matters more than you know. If you want to travel deeper into the shadows with me, into the cases that slip between state lines, into the mysteries buried under time and silence, then subscribe to Last Seen. It's free, and it makes a huge difference. Hit like, If this case stayed with you, leave a comment if you want more deep dives like this. And turn on notifications so you never miss the next story we bring back into the light. There are still so many cases waiting in the dark, so many names, so many people who were last seen and never found. I'll be here, uncovering the truth, one story at a time. And if you subscribe, you'll be right here with me when we open the next one. Stay safe, stay aware, and thanks for watching Last Seen.